And welcome back, everybody. In the last episode, we added a table, we added our config settings, generated our config file and dropped it into our folder. We created our cabinet file, dropped it into our folder, and now we're going to test what we did. For this instance, we're going to use the attack from Mars table, and we're going to use the direct output config tester utility that you can find in your direct output folder after you've installed DOF. So when we click on the shortcut for that, we select our attack from Mars as the ROM file we want to use, and we click OK. And we're hit with a .NET framework error. If we expand the error, we take a look, and we see that it has something called a short ROM name error. If you're presented with this screen, 100% you've got an entry error somewhere in that ROM where you've entered a carriage return or hit the enter key where you shouldn't have, and it has truncated the ROM and moved everything behind that error down to the next line, and DOF is looking at it and saying there's a ROM entry here, but there's no ROM name for it. So if we come up and take a look at our configurations, we don't really see anything that's wrong. And if we take a look even closer, we still don't see anything that's wrong. Everything looks to be the way that it should be in our configuration. We don't see any issues whatsoever. So how do we find the error? Well, we can go to the directoutput.log file, which you will find in your direct output folder. And we can take a look at the log. And we can see that we've got exception errors. And if we take a look above it, we see the warning that we were given originally. But that doesn't really help us narrow it down. I mean, you can go looking for this line, I suppose, in your configuration somewhere. But with serial addressable LEDs, it can get pretty deep. And it may not necessarily be that obvious to you. But we do know that this occurred in our attack from Mars configuration. So if we come up in the config data screen to the attack from Mars entry, and we look across, at first glance everything could look okay. But if we look a little more carefully, we see that this box here appears to have no entry. When we click on it, though, we see that we have information. That's your easiest indicator of where the error is. If the box looks to be blank, but it has information, then it's carrying a carriage return in it at the end of the line that's adding a second line in the box, but the box isn't big enough to show it. So to fix this, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our serial editor. We're going to click in the boxes. That ends where it's supposed to, but we see that this has an extra line entered into it from a carriage return. Come back up, hit delete, verify that that's made the correction we want. We save the data, We confirm that we want to save the data. We go back to our config data page, and we have to now import the change that we made. So if we bring in our data sources from the view, we select our table, we select our data sources, and we click on data to text, it'll bring in our new database entries that we just made with the correction. Through the miracle of the pause button, I saved you having to watch that 2-minute process. Now that everything's brought into the database, we can close that out, deselect that, we can close out our data sources. We can now save the file because we've saved the change. And if we look in our light bar box where the error was, we now see that it's been corrected. We go back to the dashboard, we generate our new file, we drop it into our config folder, overwriting the one with the error. And if we run the config tester tool again, everything goes through as planned. Now we have our complete list of outputs, and we can proceed with triggering them to do our tests. I recommend using the pulse button, not the activate button, just because it sends just a quick pulse. You can see a response, you know that it's working. Activate, well, you don't want to turn your knocker on for too long, even though it's held to 60 milliseconds in the configuration file. Still just a good idea to send the pulse. Now if we close that out and we go back to our directoutput.log file and take a look at it, we see that our exception errors are gone. Everything's loading properly. And we can walk away a happy camper knowing that we solved our problem. Sometimes our errors aren't as easy to find as you would expect. In this instance, everything is appearing in our list, but when we go to trigger our shaker motor, nothing is happening. Any one of these should be triggering the shaker motor, but the shaker motor won't trigger. Everything else that's associated with these outputs is working. Just the shaker motor isn't going off. If we come into our configuration file and we take a look, we look at the shaker motor and we see that we ended on a backslash. You never end on a backslash. You always end on a number. So we delete that out. We save it. We confirm it. Then we have to once again import it into our configuration file. Come up under View, Data Sources, Tables, Config Data. Select our tables. Click Import. And when our import is complete, we can deselect everything, close out our data sources, save the changes that we made to the actual file, come back to our dash, do our configuration, drop it into our folder, overwrite the existing one with the corrected one, and now we can run our test. Now when we run our test, we find that our shaker motor is working again. Our previous direct output log had these errors listed for exception errors, and our current direct output log no longer has the errors. Once again, we're happy campers. We solved the problem, and we're back up and running. So those are most likely the most common errors that you're going to run across when you're doing your entry. Everybody makes data entry errors. This is just a way of finding a quickest route to solving them and some suggestions as to how to solve them. Now what I have added into the dashboard screen is I've given some examples and some information as to what your common settings would be. So I've broken it into 3 parts, which is your mainboard button lighting, your mainboard toys, and I've given some examples of some easy extra effects that you can add to your playfield side strips. Basically, your columns just tell you what the settings are that are available, what the effect of them is, and basically what happens if you use the different effects and how to gauge how to enter that information. It's pretty straightforward, but it's there as a fallback in case you forget when you're doing up your configurations. That's about it for the troubleshooting. I'm sure there are other issues that will come up down the road if we find that there are common issues that we're constantly being presented with. I'll absolutely do another video on that. At this point, I'd like to take some time to make some acknowledgements for the people that gave me assistance with getting this going. Right out of the gate, I'd like to acknowledge a gentleman called TheFrugalComputerGuy, who is a YouTuber that did a terrific series on how to use LibreOffice and specifically the base function, which is the database software that we've been using. Without his tutorials online, there's no way that I would have been able to get this figured out. He has an entire channel devoted to using LibreOffice and the different tricks and tips that you can do in order to be able to create spreadsheets and use the word processor that's involved in the database entry stuff. Very, very helpful. And if you have any interest whatsoever in using LibreOffice beyond what we're doing here with the config tool utility, I'd strongly recommend his channel. As well, I'd like to thank Terry Red. Once again, his assistance was incredibly helpful. He was more than happy to answer my questions that I had with regards to how some of this stuff works behind the scenes. I'd had a little bit of experience with the serial addressable aspect, but having to create an entire new protocol for it, I needed a little more information than what I had currently sitting in my noggin. So once again, Terry, thank you very much for your help. I'd also like to thank DDH69, who did up the Doflinx software. He seemed to be more than happy to answer my questions along the way, and I'm sure I pestered him with many of them. Without the assistance of all these people, I wouldn't have been able to get this off the ground. So thanks very much, everybody, for watching, and hopefully there'll be some more videos coming down the pipe.